Aaron had never meant to find anything extraordinary that day. The scorching sun beat down on his worn-out clothes as he stumbled through the crumbling ruins of an ancient city, long forgotten by time. His boots kicked up dust with every step, and the silence around him felt oppressive. This was his life now, scavenging the remnants of a lost civilization, hoping to find anything that could be sold for enough credits to survive another week. There was nothing left of the grand cities, no signs of the once thriving empire that had ruled the stars. Only rusted metal and cracked stone remained, reminders of a forgotten past. As he moved deeper into the ruin, Aaron's eyes caught a glint of something odd, half buried beneath layers of dust and broken stone. It wasn't much, just a rusted hilt sticking out of the ground. His curiosity piqued. He knelt down and wiped away the dirt. At first, he thought it was just another piece of discarded junk, like the many tools and weapons he had found in the past. But as he grasped the hilt, he felt a strange jolt of energy course through his fingers, making his whole body stiffen. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. With a grunt, Aaron pulled the sword from the earth. The blade was covered in rust, its once sharp edge dulled by centuries of neglect. But the hilt was something else. It was carved with strange symbols, intricate patterns that Aaron had never seen before. The sword felt oddly warm, as if it was alive, and despite its age and wear, there was an undeniable weight to it. A sense of power lingered around it. And for a moment, Aaron hesitated. He had been through enough battles to know that strange artifacts often came with a price. But something about this sword made him feel different, as if it was calling out to him. He had no idea what it meant, but deep down, he knew it was important. Maybe more important than anything he had ever found. The air around him seemed to thrum with energy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He tucked the sword under his arm, feeling the weight of it pressing against him, and began to make his way out of the ruins. As Aaron walked, he noticed something else. The silence of the ruin had changed. What had been a deathly quiet now seemed unsettling. The air felt charged, almost as if something was watching him. A sudden chill crept down his spine, and his hand instinctively gripped the sword tighter. Was it just his imagination? Or had the sword done something to the atmosphere around him? His thoughts were interrupted when a voice suddenly echoed in his mind. At first, he thought it was a trick of his mind, perhaps the exhaustion from his long scavenging trip finally catching up with him. But no, this voice was clear, ancient, deep, and it seemed to speak directly to him. The Chosen One has found it. Aaron stumbled in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as the voice repeated the words, louder this time. The sword, still tucked under his arm, seemed to hum with energy, almost as if it was reacting to the voice in his head. Aaron's grip tightened on the hilt, and his pulse quickened. The sword is the key, the voice continued. It has chosen you. He shook his head in confusion. This couldn't be real. He had heard of strange phenomena, whispers in the dark, ghosts of long-dead empires, but this felt different. The words felt too real, too tangible. Suddenly, the voice shifted, as if the being speaking to him was trying to make sense of its own words. It was meant for a king, a ruler of the stars. You must understand. Aaron's mind raced. A king, ruler of the stars. He wasn't any of that. He was just a scavenger, a man trying to survive in a galaxy that had forgotten its past. His life was simple. Find scraps, sell them, repeat. He had never imagined himself as anything more. But here he was, holding a sword that seemed to carry the weight of ancient kingship. He couldn't understand it, but he could feel the truth of the words in his bones. The voice fell silent, and Aaron felt a strange emptiness inside him, as if the connection had been severed. But he wasn't alone. The sword seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, the hilt glowing faintly in the fading light of the day. Aaron looked at it again, his mind racing with questions. Who had left this sword here? Why had it chosen him? And what was this power that seemed to flow through it, calling him toward something greater than he could comprehend? He pushed the thoughts aside. The sword felt heavy in his hand, not just in weight, but in responsibility. Whatever it was, whatever it meant, he was now part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. His journey had just begun. As Aaron left the ruins behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sword was guiding him, pulling him toward something far beyond the desolate planet he called home. The galaxy was vast, and he had only scratched the surface of its mysteries. What lay ahead was unknown, but Aaron knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same again. The sword was no ordinary relic. It was a key. And the galaxy, with all its dangers and secrets, was waiting for him. Aaron had spent most of his life on the fringes of the galaxy, scavenging the remnants of forgotten civilizations. He had seen his fair share of ruins, decaying cities, long-abandoned starships, and broken tech that had been left to rot in the corners of the universe, but nothing compared to what he was about to discover. The rusty sword he had found beneath the dust of that ancient ruin seemed ordinary at first glance, but there was something about it that made his pulse race. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no mere artifact. It was more than that. It had chosen him. But why? Why had it called to him, a lowly scavenger, rather than some noble warrior or historian? These questions haunted him as he made his way through the rocky hills that led back to his makeshift camp. The sun was setting, casting a crimson hue over the desolate landscape. Aaron trudged forward, the sword still tucked under his arm. With every step, the weight of it seemed to grow heavier, as though it were burdening him with some hidden knowledge or responsibility he couldn't quite understand. His thoughts raced, his mind struggling to make sense of the strange voice that had echoed in his mind earlier. The Chosen One. Those words stuck with him, like a riddle he couldn't solve. What did it all mean? As he neared his camp, a small outpost hidden away in a canyon, Aaron noticed something that made his blood run cold. A shadow moving swiftly across the horizon. He wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was out there, watching him. Instinctively, he reached for his blaster, but his hand brushed against the sword's hilt instead. The feeling of power surged through him once again, and a strange sense of calm washed over him. The shadow grew closer, and Aaron's grip on the sword tightened. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that whatever was coming for him, the sword held the key to his survival. His heart pounded in his chest as the shadow revealed itself. A sleek, black ship hovering just above the ground, its engines humming with a deadly hum. He had seen ships like this before, highly advanced, military-grade technology. Whoever was inside had no business being here. This was not a place for starships. The ship landed with a soft thud, and the hatch opened. Out stepped a tall figure, cloaked in dark armor. Aaron's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just any soldier. The man, or whatever it was, seemed almost unnatural, his presence exuding an air of superiority. Aaron could sense that this was not someone he could fight off with brute force. "Scavenger," the armored figure said, his voice cold and mechanical. "I know what you found. You don't know what you're holding, do you?" Aaron's hand instinctively tightened around the sword's hilt, its energy flaring in response to the threat. The stranger's gaze shifted to the weapon, his eyes narrowing beneath his helmet. "You've awakened it," the figure continued, his voice laced with both admiration and disdain. "The sword of the last emperor, the key to the power that has been hidden for centuries. You are in far over your head, scavenger." Aaron stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the words. The last emperor. Hidden power. He had heard stories of powerful rulers from ancient times, but nothing like this. He hadn't signed up for any of this. All he wanted was to survive, to find enough to eat and stay off the radar of those who would do him harm. But now, it seemed that he had unknowingly stepped into a much larger story, one that spanned the fate of the galaxy itself. The figure stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to claim the sword. Aaron reacted without thinking. With a quick movement, he drew the sword from its sheath and raised it before him, its blade glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the sudden resistance. "I'll never give it to you," Aaron growled, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. He had no idea what he was doing, but something about the sword felt right in his hands. It was as if it was guiding him, protecting him. The stranger chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, cruel amusement. "You don't have a choice. The sword was never meant for someone like you. It belongs to the Emperor, and the Emperor is not someone who shares his power." Aaron didn't know how to respond. The sword had already changed his life, but this was something beyond his understanding. He felt a sudden surge of energy, the sword pulsing with an intensity that left his fingers numb. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as though the very planet itself was responding to the sword's call. "Step aside," the stranger ordered, his voice growing more forceful. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The Emperor's power is not for the likes of you. Hand it over." But before Aaron could react, a deep, rumbling voice echoed in his mind once again. The same voice from earlier, the one that had called him the Chosen One. "Do not listen to him," the voice said, filled with a quiet but undeniable authority. "The sword has chosen you. You are its master. No one else can wield its power." The voice resonated within Aaron's chest, filling him with an overwhelming sense of purpose. He felt a surge of confidence flood his veins, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the small, insignificant man he had always been. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a key, and it had chosen him. He raised the sword higher, its blade now gleaming with an eerie light. The figure before him seemed to falter, his confidence wavering for a moment as the sword's energy pressed against him like an invisible force. Aaron could feel the weight of the sword's legacy, its power, and its promise of something greater. "You don't understand," the figure said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "The Emperor's return is inevitable. The sword is not meant for you, scavenger. You will never be able to control it. Hand it over now, and I will spare your life." Aaron's grip on the sword tightened. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. The sword was his. The power it offered was his destiny, and he wasn't about to let some mysterious figure take it from him. The sword pulsed again, its energy flowing into Aaron, filling him with newfound strength. He stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the armored figure before him. The energy radiating from the sword seemed to shift the air itself, a force he had never experienced before. For the first time, Aaron felt as though he truly belonged, like he was part of something much larger than himself. The battle was about to begin. Aaron stood in the dim light, the sword gripped tightly in his hand. The strange figure before him, cloaked in black armor, seemed to waver as the power of the blade coursed through him. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen force, and Aaron's heart pounded in his chest. The voice in his mind was louder now, as if urging him to take the next step. "You are not just a scavenger anymore. You are the key to an empire." The words resonated deep within him. Aaron's grip on the hilt tightened as the sword pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but something inside him, something ancient, was awakening. The power was real, undeniable, and for the first time in his life, he felt as though he had a purpose beyond survival. The figure before him seemed to sense the change as well. The armored soldier, who had once exuded confidence, now hesitated, his eyes narrowing. His hand twitched, as though preparing for a strike. But Aaron was faster. He raised the sword higher, its blade shimmering with an unnatural light. The figure flinched, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. "You have no idea what you're holding," the figure growled. "That sword was never meant for you. It belongs to the Emperor, An emperor who will return and claim what is rightfully his. His voice was steady, but there was a trace of doubt in it now. Aaron's mind raced. The emperor, the last emperor. The words echoed in his head, but they meant nothing to him. All he knew was that the sword, the blade in his hands, was connected to something far greater than himself. And the moment the figure had threatened to take it from him, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. "I don't care who it belongs to," Aaron said, his voice low and steady, more confident than he had ever felt. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, as if they were not his own. "This sword is mine now. I won't let you take it." The figure's helmet tilted, as though considering his words. There was a long pause, a moment where time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a speed that Aaron couldn't even track, the figure lunged. Aaron barely had time to react. The sword flashed in his hand, its weight pulling him forward, and instinct took over. The blade met the figure's weapon with a loud metallic clang, sending shockwaves through the air. Aaron stumbled, his feet sliding on the loose ground, but he didn't fall. The sword, the key to something vast, was guiding him. He felt it in his bones, in every fiber of his being. The figure tried to push him back, but Aaron held his ground. The sword hummed, vibrating with a power that seemed to surge through the entire world around them. He didn't know how he was doing it. He wasn't trained for this, wasn't a warrior. But the sword was more than just a weapon. It was a living thing, a force that responded to him, guided him. With a twist of his wrist, Aaron sent the figure's blade flying to the side, knocking it out of his grip. The figure staggered, momentarily stunned. Aaron didn't hesitate. He raised the sword high, feeling the energy thrumming through it, and brought it down in a powerful arc. The figure barely managed to block with his arm, the force of the blow sending a shockwave through the air. Sparks flew from the clash, and Aaron could feel the heat radiating from the impact. For a brief moment, Aaron thought he might have actually won. The figure was wounded, his armor cracked in places, and the once confident stance had faltered. But the soldier was far from finished. With a growl of frustration, he lunged again, this time faster, more desperate. Aaron barely managed to dodge the attack, sidestepping just in time. The sword felt alive in his hand, its power guiding his movements. It was almost as though it anticipated the figure's every move, responding to his own growing sense of urgency. The sword wasn't just a weapon. It was a partner, a force that could not be denied. As the figure advanced once more, Aaron's mind raced. He couldn't keep this up forever. He wasn't a soldier, and this battle was draining him. His arms were sore, his muscles straining with the effort of holding the sword. But then, just as the figure moved to strike, something clicked within him. He knew what he had to do. He didn't fight the soldier's move. He didn't try to block or dodge. Instead, Aaron stepped forward, meeting the figure head-on. The sword glowed brighter, and with a single, powerful motion, he struck. The blade cleaved through the figure's armor like it was made of paper, and with a howl of pain, the soldier was sent crashing to the ground. For a moment, everything was still. Aaron stood over the fallen figure, panting heavily, his heart racing. The sword in his hand hummed, its energy fading, but there was still an undeniable sense of power flowing through him. The figure remained motionless, his dark armor cracked and broken. Aaron took a step back, his mind reeling. What had just happened? He had fought a soldier, a being far stronger and more skilled than he was, and he had won. But he hadn't done it alone. The sword had been with him, guiding him, giving him strength. It had chosen him for a reason. The figure on the ground stirred, groaning in pain. He tried to rise, but his body seemed uncooperative, his movements slow and sluggish. Aaron raised the sword, ready to strike again if necessary, but the figure held up his hand in surrender. "Finish it," the soldier spat, his voice weak but defiant. "The Emperor will return. You can't stop him. No one can." His eyes were filled with rage, but there was something else there, something Aaron couldn't place. Fear, desperation. Aaron hesitated. He had the power to end it now, to kill the soldier and be done with it. But something held him back. This wasn't his fight. He wasn't a killer, not by nature. He had only wanted to survive. He lowered the sword, taking a step back. "I'm not here to start a war," Aaron said, his voice steady but conflicted. "I just want to know what's going on. What does the Emperor have to do with this sword?" The soldier looked up at him, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You don't know what you're holding. The sword is a key. It will unlock the path to the Emperor's return. And when he comes back, the galaxy will kneel before him. You can't stop it." Aaron took a deep breath, his mind swirling with the soldier's words. The Emperor, the key, the sword. It was all too much, too confusing. He had no answers, only more questions. As the soldier staggered to his feet, Aaron didn't know what to do next. The path before him was uncertain, filled with danger and mystery. But the sword in his hand, the power it held, it was his to command now. And whether he was ready or not, his destiny had already begun to unfold. The soldier turned and limped away, disappearing into the distance. Aaron watched him go, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had chosen not to kill them, but that didn't mean the fight was over. The Emperor was coming, and the sword was the key. And Aaron, for better or worse, was its chosen bearer. Aaron stood there in the aftermath of the battle, his breath heavy and ragged. The sword in his hand still hummed with power, though its glow had dimmed, as if sensing the end of the confrontation. He glanced down at the soldier, who was slowly retreating into the shadows, and his mind buzzed with the soldier's cryptic words. The Emperor, the sword, a key to something larger, something that would change everything. Aaron had always been a scavenger, a wanderer. His life had been simple. Find whatever scraps were left behind from the wars, the battles, the chaos that ravaged the world. He'd never asked for more, never even thought about it. But now, it seemed as if fate had thrown him into something far beyond his comprehension. The sword wasn't just a relic. It was a tool, a key to unlocking something massive. And now he was bound to it. He turned away from the soldier's retreating figure, his mind trying to grasp what had just happened. What was the Emperor? Why had the sword chosen him? He had no answers, just a sense of foreboding gnawing at his insides, a feeling that whatever was coming, he would be at the center of it. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to face a galactic empire, an emperor with the power to reshape the galaxy. But then again, who was? His eyes drifted to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. He had always found comfort in the quiet of the ruins, the silence of a world forgotten. But now, even the silence felt oppressive. His hand tightened around the sword, as if it could give him the answers he sought. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. He turned just in time to see a figure emerging from the mist, another cloaked figure, though this one was not armored like the soldier he had just fought. No, this one carried an aura of mystery, of purpose. She was tall, her movements deliberate, and there was something about the way she held herself that made it clear she wasn't just some wanderer like him. "I see you've made your choice," the woman said, her voice calm but sharp, carrying the weight of experience. Her eyes, a piercing shade of green, studied Aaron with an intensity that made him uneasy. Aaron took a step back, instinctively raising the sword in front of him. His heart was pounding, but his mind was more focused now. He wasn't sure who she was, but she seemed to know far more than he did, and that made her dangerous. "Who are you?" Aaron asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The woman didn't flinch at the weapon in his hand. "I am someone who's been waiting for you," she said. "The sword has chosen you, Aaron. You've felt it, haven't you? The power that's growing inside you. You're no longer just a scavenger. You're part of something much larger than you could have ever imagined." Aaron's grip on the sword tightened. What do you mean? What's happening? What is this sword? She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. That sword is the last of its kind. It was forged long ago, during a time when the galaxy was ruled by an emperor who sought to unite all worlds under his rule. But that empire fell, shattered by betrayal and rebellion. The sword, however, remained. It waited for the one who would wield it, the one who would restore what was lost. Aaron frowned, trying to process the woman's words. Restore? What do you mean? How can I? You've already begun, she interrupted, her tone unwavering. You've already fought with the sword, felt its power. The Emperor may be lost to time, but his return is inevitable. The sword is the key to unlocking his return, and to the return of the empire he once led. Aaron's mind spun with confusion. The Emperor, the sword, a fallen empire. It all sounded like a story too big for him. He had never been a part of anything so grand. He had never wanted to be. All he had ever wanted was to survive, to keep his head down, and stay out of the wars that had torn apart his world. Now, it seemed as though the universe had decided otherwise. The sword chose me, Aaron said, more to himself than to her. But I don't know anything about empires or rulers. I'm not ready for this. The woman's gaze softened slightly, but there was still an unyielding edge to her words. No one is ever ready for something like this. But it's too late for hesitation. The Emperor's return is imminent, and if you don't learn to wield the sword, to understand its power, the consequences will be far greater than you can imagine. Aaron swallowed, his throat dry. What do I have to do? How can I? You must find the lost cities, she replied, her voice low and urgent. The Emperor's empire is built on ancient technology, scattered across the galaxy, and the sword is the key to unlocking it. You must travel, seek out the remnants of the empire, and restore what was once lost. But be warned, you are not the only one searching for the Emperor's return. There are others who would see him rise again, but not for the good of the galaxy. They will stop at nothing to claim the sword for themselves. Aaron's stomach twisted. He had thought that fighting one soldier had been difficult. He had no idea what awaited him out there, but there was something in the woman's eyes that told him he had no choice. The sword had chosen him for a reason, and that reason was far larger than anything he had ever faced. He was no longer just a wanderer, a survivor. He was the key to the return of an empire, and the galaxy's fate rested on his shoulders. The sword will guide you, the woman continued, but you must learn to control its power. You are the last hope to restore balance. If you fail, there will be nothing left but darkness. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of her words settled on him. He had always been just a man, alone in a broken world. But now it seemed as though he was something far more. The sword was his, and the empire, its secrets, were waiting for him. I don't know if I'm ready, Aaron whispered, almost to himself. You don't have a choice, she replied, turning to leave. The Emperor's return is inevitable, and when he comes, the galaxy will be changed forever. You will either stand with him or stand against him. Aaron stood there for a long moment, the sword still gripped in his hand. The woman's words echoed in his mind, a weight he couldn't escape. There was no going back now. The galaxy was on the brink of something far greater than he could comprehend, and he was about to be thrust into the heart of it. The question was no longer whether he was ready. It was whether he could survive what was coming next. Aaron's mind raced as he stood in the ruins, the weight of his fate pressing down on him like a stone. The sword in his hand seemed to hum with a life of its own, its strange energy pulsing through his veins, reminding him that he was no longer just a scavenger. The woman had left, vanishing into the mist with her cryptic warning, but her words lingered in his mind. The Emperor, the lost cities, the sword. He couldn't escape them. No matter how much he wanted to go back to his old life, to the days of scavenging in the quiet ruins, those days were gone. The sword had chosen him, and now, The galaxy's future depended on him understanding its power. But how could he? How could someone like him, someone with no training, no experience with ancient artifacts or galactic empires, be expected to wield such an important weapon? His hand gripped the hilt of the sword tighter, almost as if the weapon could offer him some answers. But there was only silence. The sword didn't speak to him. It didn't offer any guidance, and that terrified him. He had always survived by his wits, by staying one step ahead of danger. But this was different. This was no mere battle for survival. This was something far bigger. The return of an emperor. The rise of an empire. A galaxy waiting to be reshaped. But who was this emperor? What had happened to him? The woman had said he was lost to time, shattered by betrayal and rebellion. But if that was the case, why was the sword still here? Why had it chosen him? He needed answers, but he had no idea where to start looking. For the first time in years, Aaron felt truly lost. The vastness of the galaxy, once something he had avoided thinking about, now loomed before him like a never-ending expanse of questions and unknowns. He had to find the lost cities, the remnants of the Emperor's empire, and unlock the secrets hidden within. But how? The woman had said the sword was the key, but it hadn't given him any direction, any clue on what to do next. The sound of a distant rumble brought him out of his thoughts. The ground shook slightly beneath his feet, and the sky overhead darkened, as though warning him of the challenges to come. The universe was shifting, and Aaron was caught in its wake. He had no choice but to move forward. But where? Aaron's gaze turned to the horizon once more. The mist was thickening, swallowing up the remnants of the battle, and the soldier he had defeated. There was only one thing left to do: find the lost cities. The Emperor's empire might have fallen, but its remnants still existed, scattered across the galaxy. And the sword, with its ancient power, was the key to unlocking them. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of another figure, a man, emerging from the fog with the ease of someone who belonged here. Aaron tensed, instinctively ready to defend himself. But as the figure drew closer, Aaron realized that this was no enemy. There was something about him, something familiar, like a shadow from a past Aaron couldn't remember. The man stopped a few feet away from Aaron, his dark eyes scanning him with an unsettling intensity. He wore simple clothes, yet there was an air of authority about him, as though he had seen and done things that others could never imagine. "Aaron," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "I've been looking for you." Aaron didn't lower his sword. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The man smiled faintly, his gaze flicking to the sword in Aaron's hand. "I've been following the sword's trail for a long time. It's taken me through countless worlds, searching for its chosen bearer. And now, here you are." Aaron's grip on the sword tightened. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. I'm just trying to survive." The man's smile didn't fade. "You don't have a choice anymore. You are the chosen bearer of the sword. Whether you like it or not, you are part of something much larger than yourself. The Emperor's return is inevitable, and you are the key to unlocking it." Aaron's heart skipped a beat. "The Emperor? What do you mean?" The man's expression turned serious. The Emperor's empire was built on ancient technology, technology that has been lost to time. The sword you carry is one of the last remaining pieces of that empire, and you are the only one who can unlock its power. Aaron's mind spun. "I don't know anything about this. I'm just a scavenger. Why me?" The man stepped forward, his eyes locking with Aaron's. "Because you have something others don't. The sword chose you. It's waiting for you to unlock its secrets. You're the only one who can restore what was lost." Aaron took a step back, his mind racing. He had never wanted any of this. He had never asked for the sword, for the Emperor, for any of it. All he wanted was to be left alone. But now, it seemed like there was no escape. The galaxy was changing, and he was at the center of it. "I don't want this," Aaron whispered, almost to himself. The man's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them. None of us want the responsibility that comes with power. But the universe doesn't care what we want. It only cares about what needs to be done. And right now, the galaxy needs you. Aaron felt the weight of the sword in his hand, and with it the weight of the galaxy's future. He was no longer just a scavenger. He was the key to something far bigger. The Emperor's return was inevitable, and Aaron was the one who had to decide how it would all unfold. He turned away from the man, his heart heavy with the knowledge that there was no turning back. The journey had already begun. Aaron trudged through the barren land, the weight of the sword in his hand growing heavier with each step. The air was thick with a strange tension, the kind that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The man who had appeared out of the mist, the one who seemed to know so much about the Emperor's return, had left him with only more questions. He hadn't given Aaron any answers, only more pieces to a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. The sword was the key. But to what? The lost cities. The Emperor's empire. These were the only clues he had, and they felt like breadcrumbs scattered across an infinite, empty galaxy. Aaron had no idea where to begin looking. The woman, too, had said little about where the lost cities were located, only that they held the secrets of the Emperor's power. He could almost feel the weight of those secrets pressing down on him. He had spent years wandering the ruins, picking up scraps of forgotten history, but now it seemed as though history had picked him, and he had no choice but to follow. He wasn't ready. He wasn't even close. Yet it was all happening. Too fast, too big, too overwhelming. As he walked, his thoughts kept returning to the Emperor, the fallen empire. What had happened to it? Why had it collapsed? And why, of all people, had the sword chosen him? He wasn't special. He wasn't even a soldier, much less a leader. He was just Aaron, a man who had learned to survive by picking through the remnants of a broken world. But the sword had chosen him, and that meant something that terrified him. The sun had long since set, and the stars above shimmered with an eerie glow. The vast emptiness of space felt like a reminder that he was alone. He had no guide, no map, no allies, just the sword and the knowledge that his path would lead him to places he couldn't yet imagine. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was shattered by a low hum, like an engine winding up. Aaron froze, instinctively clutching the sword tighter, his senses on high alert. The sound grew louder, closer. He didn't need to see it to know something was coming. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and a shadow passed over him, blocking out the stars. He glanced up, and his breath caught in his throat. A ship. A massive, sleek craft descending from the sky like a predator stalking its prey. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, dark, angular, and impossibly large. The sound of its engines roared as it landed with a thud, sending dust and debris flying in every direction. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as the ship's hatch slowly opened, revealing a figure clad in dark armor, its features hidden behind a helmet. The figure stepped down, boots crunching against the dirt as it moved toward Aaron. The air around him seemed to shift, becoming thicker, heavier, like a storm was about to break. "Aaron," the figure said, its voice mechanical, cold. "The Emperor has called for you." Aaron didn't know how to respond. His mind was racing, but his body was frozen in place. The Emperor? How could this person know his name? How could they possibly know about the sword? The questions came fast and furious, but all Aaron could do was stand there, the sword in his hand suddenly feeling like a burden, a reminder that he was part of something much bigger than he ever wanted. "You have something that belongs to the Emperor," the figure continued, its tone devoid of emotion. "Hand over the sword, and we will take you to him. There is no need for resistance." Aaron's grip on the sword tightened. He had no idea who these people were, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't here for friendly reasons. This wasn't a simple offer. The Emperor's name didn't come with kindness. The sword was his. He could feel its power, its importance, deep within his bones. It wasn't just a relic, it was a beacon, a symbol. And no one would take it from him, not without a fight. "I'm not handing this over to anyone," Aaron said, his voice low, steady. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving the figure before him. The armored figure didn't flinch, it didn't even seem to care. It raised a hand, and Aaron's eyes widened as energy crackled around the figure's fingers, sparks of bright blue light dancing in the air. In an instant, the figure moved with lightning speed, closing the distance between them in a blur. Before Aaron could react, a powerful force hit him, knocking him off his feet and sending him crashing to the ground. The sword flew from his grasp, landing a few feet away, its glowing blade now dim in the dust. The figure loomed over him, its cold eyes behind the helmet focused on Aaron with unyielding determination. "The Emperor's return is inevitable, Aaron. You will come with us. It is your destiny." Aaron's chest heaved with every breath, his body aching from the impact. But the fear in his heart had nothing to do with the pain. He knew this wasn't just about the sword anymore. This was about the Emperor, about the power he held, the empire he had left behind, and the future of the galaxy. With a sudden burst of strength, Aaron pushed himself to his feet, reaching for the sword. As his fingers brushed against its hilt, a surge of energy shot through him, flooding his body with power he couldn't explain. The sword vibrated in his grip, and for the first time, it seemed to respond to him. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was alive, pulsing with a force that felt both alien and familiar. It was calling to him, urging him to stand up, to fight. The figure didn't move, its posture unwavering as it watched Aaron with cold, calculating eyes. "You don't understand," it said. "The Emperor has chosen his successor. That successor is not you." Aaron stood tall, the sword now firmly in his grip. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was stronger than it had ever been. He wasn't ready, but he was never going to be ready until he took that first step. "I am the one the sword chose," Aaron said, his voice quiet but full of strength. "And I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The armored figure stared at him for a long moment, its silence heavy in the air. Finally, it stepped back, its hand dropping to its side. "This is not over, Aaron," it said, its voice still cold and emotionless. "The Emperor's return cannot be stopped. You will face him. And when you do, you will understand the truth." With that, the figure turned and walked back toward the ship, the hatch closing behind it with a hiss. The ship rose into the sky, disappearing into the dark expanse of space, leaving Aaron standing alone in the quiet aftermath. He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know what it all meant. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The Emperor's return was inevitable, and Aaron was about to become a part of it, whether he was ready or not.